Welcome to our channel. Today, we drift into one of the most transformative and devastating periods in modern history, the Great Depression, a time when economies collapsed, millions of lives were upended, and the very foundations of nations were shaken. In this video, we will explore how this global catastrophe unfolded, the human stories behind the statistics, the responses of governments around the world, and the lasting legacy that continues to shape our world today. Prepare to journey through history as we uncover the profound impact of the Great Depression on economies, societies, and the course of the 20th century. The 1920s, often referred to as the Roaring Twenties, were a time of extraordinary change and paradox. On the surface, it seemed as though the world, particularly the United States, had finally emerged from the shadow of World War I into an era of unbridled prosperity, optimism, and innovation. Cities were alive with electric lights, jazz music floated through smoky clubs, and the pace of life seemed faster, brighter, and louder than ever before. Men in tailored suits and women with bobbed hair and fringed dresses danced in speakeasies, celebrating a newfound sense of freedom. Automobiles became more than just a mode of transportation. They were symbols of independence, status, and the limitless possibilities of modern life. The assembly lines churned out not only cars but radios, household appliances, and luxury goods, all promising comfort, convenience, and the appearance of wealth. The roaring streets and the glamorous advertisements seemed to proclaim that society had entered a new age of abundance, one where the future was bright, infinite, and unshakable. Yet beneath this veneer of glamour and excitement lay an economic structure that was fragile and precarious. While the stock market soared and cities expanded with unprecedented speed, much of this growth was built on borrowed money and speculative investments rather than solid, sustainable foundations. Banks lent freely, often without sufficient oversight or concern for the capacity of borrowers to repay. Credit became the lifeblood of the American consumer economy. Middle-class families, eager to partake in the prosperity surrounding them, purchased radios, refrigerators, and even automobiles on installment plans that allowed them to pay over time. To many, it seemed like a revolution of opportunity. Anyone could enjoy the fruits of modernity if they were willing to take a small risk. But these installment plans, while democratizing access to consumer goods, masked a growing vulnerability. The illusion of wealth was everywhere, but the reality was that millions were accumulating debt they could not repay if economic conditions shifted. The stock market became the ultimate symbol of this fragility, a glittering stage upon which the nation's hopes, fears, and ambitions played out. Stocks were no longer just investments for the wealthy. Ordinary Americans, inspired by sensationalist newspapers and the stories of rapid fortunes, were pouring their life savings into the market. Brokerage firms offered easy credit to buy stocks on margin, meaning people could borrow money to invest, amplifying both potential gains and potential losses. The stock ticker tape became a constant thrill, and every day brought new stories of unimaginable wealth. Yet the foundation of this boom was increasingly speculative. Companies were overvalued, profits were uneven, and the gap between the wealthy elite and the average worker widened with each passing year. While some Americans enjoyed unprecedented luxury, millions remained on the margins, dependent on wages that did not reflect the dazzling growth seen in corporate boardrooms. Agriculture, a sector that had once been the backbone of the American economy, was also under immense strain. Farmers had expanded production during World War I to meet global demand, borrowing heavily to purchase land, equipment, and seed. But when the war ended, European agriculture began to recover, and demand for American crops dropped sharply. Prices fell, debts remained, and many farmers faced foreclosure. In the rural heartland, the optimism of the 1920s never fully arrived. The contrast between urban prosperity and rural hardship highlighted the unevenness of economic growth and the unsustainable nature of the national boom. At the same time, the broader world economy was deeply interconnected, and America's role as a global lender made its stability crucial to nations still recovering from the devastation of World War I. Countries like Germany, struggling to pay reparations, relied on American loans to stabilize their economies. Britain and France, weighed down by war debts, depended on international trade and investment to rebuild infrastructure and maintain political stability. This delicate web of financial interdependence meant that any disturbance in the United States had the potential to ripple across continents, touching lives in distant cities, farms, and factories in ways that most Americans could not have imagined. Despite the warning signs, mounting consumer debt, speculative excess, and uneven economic growth, confidence remained high. The 1920s were a time when faith in progress and technology seemed limitless. Automobiles, radios, and electrical appliances were seen not only as conveniences, but as symbols of a society moving inexorably toward a brighter, more prosperous future. Cities expanded, skyscrapers rose, and people believed that nothing could halt the march of modernity. Business leaders spoke of perpetual growth, and the media celebrated the stock market's rise as proof that capitalism had achieved a new, almost magical stability. Yet, like a house of cards built on sand, the structures supporting this prosperity were inherently unstable, and they were waiting for the smallest tremor to collapse. That tremor arrived on October 24, 1929, a day that would come to be known as Black Thursday. On that day, the stock market experienced a sudden, massive sell-off. Investors, sensing trouble, rushed to liquidate their holdings, sending prices tumbling. Panic spread, magnified by a lack of regulation, communication, and understanding of the market's fragility. By the end of the day, billions of dollars in wealth had vanished into thin air, and the illusion of stability was shattered. The following week, October 29, Black Tuesday, cemented the crash in history. Stock prices plummeted further, wiping out fortunes overnight. The consequences were immediate and profound. Banks that had lent money to investors found themselves insolvent. Businesses faced sudden shortages of capital, and ordinary citizens who had invested their savings were left destitute. The crash was not merely a financial event. It was a social and psychological shock. Americans who had believed in the limitless potential of the stock market confronted the harsh reality that wealth could be fleeting and that prosperity could vanish as quickly as it appeared. Entire communities faced bankruptcy, unemployment soared, and the once vibrant optimism of the 1920s evaporated almost overnight. Families who had aspired to a middle-class lifestyle found themselves unable to pay rent or feed their children. Breadlines and soup kitchens became grim symbols of a society in distress, illustrating the human cost of a financial collapse that had begun in the abstract world of stocks and bonds, but now reached deep into everyday life. Even as the United States grappled with its sudden economic collapse, the global implications were impossible to ignore. Europe, already struggling with post-war recovery, was heavily dependent on American loans. When U.S. banks called in debts, European economies faltered. Germany, in particular, faced a dire situation. The Weimar Republic was already politically unstable, and the sudden withdrawal of American capital triggered a cascade of business failures and unemployment. This economic despair created fertile ground for radical ideologies and political movements, demonstrating how closely economic collapse and social upheaval could be intertwined. Meanwhile, Britain and France, whose economies were tied to global trade, felt the impact of declining exports. Nations around the world, from Japan to Latin America, experienced similar disruptions. Japan, facing reduced demand for its exports, began to adopt aggressive expansionist policies in search of resources, while countries in South America saw commodity prices collapse, devastating local economies. The Great Depression, which began as an American crisis, rapidly transformed into a global phenomenon, illustrating the fragile interdependence of early 20th century economies and the speed at which financial panic could traverse oceans. The human experience of this era is difficult to overstate. While statistics show unemployment rates and bank failures, the daily reality was one of uncertainty, fear, and hardship. Millions of families faced the loss of savings, homes, and livelihoods. Farmers abandoned fields that no longer generated profit, moving to cities in search of work that often did not exist. Children grew up in households where every day was a struggle, and the psychological impact of economic insecurity left a lasting imprint on an entire generation. The Great Depression was not just an economic event. It was a cultural and social rupture that reshaped the fabric of societies around the world. The Roaring Twenties, in retrospect, can be seen as both a prelude and a warning. It was an era of exuberance and innovation, yes, but also a time of imbalance, overconfidence, and unsustainable practices. The crash of 1929 did not occur in isolation. It was the inevitable outcome of years of financial speculation, uneven growth, and structural weaknesses in both the American and global economies. It revealed the interconnectedness of nations, the volatility of human behavior in financial markets, and the profound consequences of systemic economic fragility. As we look back on this period, it is clear that the lessons of the 1920s are enduring. The allure of easy money, the neglect of risk, and the over-reliance on speculative wealth are dangers that have echoed through history, reappearing in financial crises decades later. The Roaring Twenties were not simply a period of carefree indulgence. They were the calm before a storm that would change the world forever. The Great Depression, which followed, would not only devastate economies, but also transform political landscapes, social structures, and the global balance of power. It was a moment in history that revealed both the brilliance and the fragility of modern society, a lesson in how prosperity built on shaky foundations can collapse with catastrophic speed. The shockwaves of the American economic collapse were felt almost instantly across the globe. The United States, emerging from World War I as the world's preeminent economic power, had become the financial lifeline for many nations. European economies, still fragile and attempting to recover from the devastation of war, relied heavily on American loans and investments. Germany, in particular, had borrowed extensively from American banks under the Dawes Plan, a system designed to stabilize reparations payments and rebuild the German economy. When the stock market crashed and American banks began calling in their loans, Germany faced a sudden, catastrophic withdrawal of capital. Factories closed, banks failed, and unemployment skyrocketed. The German people, already burdened with the humiliating terms of the Treaty of Versailles, found themselves plunged into deeper despair. The streets of Berlin, Munich, and other cities were filled with men and women desperate for work, for food, for hope. Every business closure, every evicted tenant, every family thrown into poverty was a reminder that the world's economic fate was intricately linked and that no nation could thrive in isolation. The political consequences in Germany were immediate and profound. The Weimar Republic, already fragile and politically fragmented, struggled to respond to the crisis. Governments fell, coalitions collapsed, and extremist parties seized the opportunity to exploit the public's anger and fear. Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party, presenting themselves as saviors of the nation, promised stability, jobs, and national pride to a population drowning in economic despair. The crash of the American economy did not just impoverish Germany, it created the perfect conditions for radical political movements to gain traction. Desperation fueled nationalism, and nationalism paved the way for global conflict. It was a chilling demonstration of how economic turmoil could quickly translate into political upheaval. Across the English Channel, Britain faced its own set of challenges. The country had relied heavily on international trade and had a significant portion of its economy tied to exports. As American demand for British goods fell, factories closed and workers were laid off. Cities like Manchester, Birmingham, and Glasgow, which had once thrived on textiles, shipbuilding, and manufacturing, were suddenly gripped by unemployment and poverty. The British government attempted to respond with a combination of austerity measures and public works programs, but the scale of the crisis often overwhelmed these efforts. Communities that had once experienced relative stability now faced breadlines, foreclosures, and the psychological weight of economic insecurity. Social unrest began to simmer. Strikes and protests, though often peaceful, reflected a growing frustration with political leaders who seemed unable to address the crisis. France, similarly dependent on both trade and loans, faced a cascading set of problems. Agricultural prices fell, industrial output declined, and unemployment increased. Rural communities, which had once been relatively insulated from the worst excesses of industrial capitalism, found themselves confronting the harsh realities of economic interdependence. Farmers could no longer sell crops at prices that covered their costs, leading to abandoned fields, lost incomes, and growing migration to urban areas. In the cities, the working class bore the brunt of factory closures and wage reductions, while middle-class families saw their savings evaporate as banks failed or restricted withdrawals. The psychological toll was immense. People who had believed in the security of their nation, in the resilience of its economy, now questioned both their government and their future. In Asia, the effects of the American crash were equally pronounced. Japan, reliant on the export of goods such as silk and manufactured products to the United States, faced declining demand almost immediately. Factories closed, workers were laid off, and the government struggled to stabilize the economy. The economic hardships in Japan fueled a sense of urgency among militarists and expansionists who argued that the nation needed to secure resources abroad. Economic instability at home became intertwined with aggressive foreign policy, setting the stage for imperial ambitions in Manchuria and beyond. The link between financial crisis and militaristic expansion was stark and troubling, showing how economic shocks could ripple through societies in unexpected and dangerous ways. In Latin America, the dependence on commodity exports created a different but equally devastating set of challenges. Countries like Brazil, Argentina, Chile, and Mexico relied heavily on coffee, sugar, copper, and other raw materials for their income. As global demand collapsed and prices plummeted, entire economies were thrown into turmoil. Farmers and miners lost their livelihoods, governments faced budget crises, and social unrest grew. In some regions, people were forced to migrate in search of work, while in others, revolutionary movements gained traction among populations disillusioned by the failure of traditional political and economic systems to provide stability. The ripple effect of the American crash was global, touching not only industrialized nations, but also those whose economies were largely resource-dependent. One of the most striking features of the global impact of the Great Depression was the speed with which it spread. In today's terms, information and capital move almost instantaneously, but even in the 1930s, the interconnectedness of international finance allowed a crisis in one country to have immediate consequences elsewhere. Banks in London and Paris were connected to loans in New York. Trade routes carried goods and prices across oceans, and political stability in one nation often depended on economic stability in another. The American stock market crash, therefore, was not a local event but a global phenomenon, a tremor that shook the foundations of economies worldwide. As economies contracted, governments faced unprecedented challenges. Protectionist policies, such as high tariffs and quotas, were implemented in an attempt to shield domestic industries. In the United States, the Smoot-Hawley Tariff of 1930 raised duties on imported goods, intending to protect American businesses. However, these measures often backfired. Other nations retaliated with their own tariffs, international trade declined further, and the global economy sank deeper into depression. The lesson was clear: in a world so tightly linked, isolating one nation's economy rarely insulated it from harm. The interconnectedness that had facilitated growth now amplified collapse. The human cost of this global economic implosion was staggering. Unemployment soared worldwide, reaching levels that had been unimaginable just a few years earlier. Millions faced destitution, and entire societies were forced to confront poverty on a scale that was unprecedented in modern history. Families who had once experienced security found themselves living in boarding houses or makeshift shantytowns. Children were forced to leave school to help support their families, and malnutrition became widespread in urban and rural areas alike. The psychological toll was immense. Hope, once abundant during the heady years of the 1920s, became scarce, replaced by anxiety, despair, and fear of the future. In countries such as Germany and Japan, economic hardship became a catalyst for political extremism. In Germany, the inability of the government to provide relief or employment created fertile ground for the Nazi Party, which promised to restore national pride and economic stability. In Japan, militaristic leaders argued that expansion and conquest were necessary to secure resources and sustain the economy. In other regions, social unrest manifested in strikes, protests, and uprisings, reflecting the profound link between economic hardship and political instability. The Great Depression demonstrated that financial crises are never merely economic. They are deeply intertwined with social, political, and cultural consequences. The global banking system, too, faced unprecedented strain. As banks failed in the United States, European banks that had lent to American investors found themselves insolvent. Credit dried up, further hampering industrial activity, trade, and investment. Governments were forced to intervene in ways that had never been attempted before, from providing emergency loans to guaranteeing deposits. In some cases, these interventions were successful, but in many others, they were insufficient to prevent widespread collapse. The fragility of the international financial system became painfully clear, and the lesson was learned the hard way. Economic stability in one nation could no longer be assumed to be independent of events abroad. The cultural and psychological ramifications of the global depression were also profound. Art, literature, and cinema reflected the despair and uncertainty of the era. Writers chronicled the struggles of ordinary people, capturing the tension between hope and hopelessness. Filmmakers depicted breadlines, homelessness, and the human consequences of financial collapse. while artists conveyed the stark realities of urban and rural poverty through expressionist and realist styles. These cultural expressions were not mere commentary. They were a reflection of societies grappling with the enormity of a crisis that had no easy solution. The Great Depression also forced nations to reconsider their economic theories and policies. The collapse challenged traditional laissez-faire approaches, demonstrating that unregulated markets could lead to catastrophic outcomes. Economists began to explore new frameworks, emphasizing government intervention, social safety nets, and monetary policy as tools to stabilize economies. The ideas of John Maynard Keynes, advocating for proactive fiscal policy to counteract economic downturns, began to gain prominence, reshaping the intellectual foundations of economic management worldwide. In sum, the domino effect of the Great Depression illustrates the profound interdependence of the global economy. What began as a financial crisis in the United States rapidly became a worldwide catastrophe, touching every continent and affecting millions of lives. Political movements, social structures, and cultural expressions were all transformed by the economic collapse, demonstrating that no nation, no matter how powerful, could insulate itself from the reverberations of global financial interconnectedness. The crisis revealed vulnerabilities in banking, trade, and governance, forcing nations to rethink not only their economic policies, but also their roles in an increasingly interdependent world. The lessons of this era resonate even today. The speed and scope of the Great Depression's impact serve as a warning of the fragility inherent in tightly linked economies. It underscores the potential for local financial missteps to trigger global consequences, the vulnerability of political systems to economic stress, and the human cost of financial collapse. The world learned, in the hardest possible way, that prosperity is never guaranteed, that markets are not infallible, and that international cooperation and regulation are essential to maintaining stability in an interconnected global system. The American stock market crash was only the beginning of a complex and devastating chain of events that spread across oceans and continents, leaving no society untouched. It was a wake-up call to the world, a stark reminder that economic policy, social welfare, and political foresight are not separate considerations, but integral to the stability and survival of nations. The dominoes had fallen, and the pattern of collapse, struggle, and eventual adaptation would define the 1930s, shaping the political, social, and economic contours of the modern world. The Great Depression, often measured in statistics and economic indicators, truly revealed its enormity through the lives of the people who endured it. Behind the staggering numbers of bank failures, unemployment rates, and falling GDP lay countless stories of suffering, resilience, and adaptation. Millions of families, from the bustling cities of New York and Berlin to the rural plains of Kansas and Argentina, faced a reality they had never imagined, one in which daily survival became a central concern, where every meal, every paycheck, and every roof over their heads hung in precarious balance. In the United States, the human cost was immediate and visible. The crash of 1929 had wiped out not only fortunes, but also the sense of security that had defined the 1920s. Families who had once dreamed of middle-class prosperity found themselves standing in breadlines, queuing for soup from charitable organizations, or forced into makeshift housing in overcrowded shantytowns that came to be known as Hoovervilles. A bitterly ironic nod to President Herbert Hoover, whom many blamed for the economic collapse, cities across the country became patchworks of despair, Skyscrapers gleamed in the financial districts, but nearby neighborhoods were filled with boarded-up storefronts, silent factories, and streets lined with the unemployed, each person carrying the weight of anxiety and humiliation. The psychological toll was immense. Pride, independence, and self-reliance, values deeply embedded in American culture, were challenged daily as families struggled to survive. Parents could no longer provide reliably for their children, and children, in turn, bore witness to hardship that would shape their lives forever. The plight of farmers was particularly acute. The agricultural sector, already weakened by overproduction and falling prices throughout the 1920s, faced devastation. Crops failed not only because of economic conditions, but also due to environmental catastrophe. The Dust Bowl, a series of severe droughts combined with unsustainable farming practices, transformed the Great Plains into a vast expanse of dry, blowing soil. Wheat fields became deserts, cattle perished, and countless farms were abandoned as families left in search of work, often traveling hundreds of miles in rickety vehicles or on foot. Dust storms, black, choking, and relentless, swept across the plains, destroying homes, livestock, and livelihoods. These migrating families, known as Akis and Arkis, after the states from which many came, traveled westward to California and other regions, only to encounter new hardships. Jobs were scarce, housing was inadequate, and resentment from local populations added social tension to an already desperate situation. Urban areas were no refuge. Cities faced soaring unemployment, with figures reaching unprecedented levels. Factory closures and wage cuts left millions without income. In New York, Chicago, Detroit, and countless other industrial hubs, families crowded into small apartments or temporary shelters. Children often left school to work or beg, while mothers and fathers struggled to feed their families. The stress of financial insecurity took a psychological toll. Depression, anxiety, and a sense of hopelessness pervaded households. Many men, unable to fulfill their role as breadwinners, experienced profound shame, while women often took on multiple jobs or resorted to informal labor, such as laundry, sewing, or selling homemade goods, to keep their families afloat. The social fabric was strained. Neighborhoods once characterized by cohesion became battlegrounds of scarcity, competition, and survival. The impact of the Great Depression was not limited to the United States. In Germany, the collapse of American loans precipitated mass unemployment and poverty, particularly in industrial regions like the Ruhr Valley. Families who had once depended on steady factory wages found themselves destitute overnight. Children went hungry, and women often turned to informal labor markets, producing goods at home or engaging in small-scale trade to make ends meet. The despair of ordinary citizens created fertile ground for extremist ideologies, but it also highlighted resilience. Communities organized mutual aid networks, charities, and support systems, often relying on neighbors, churches, or local associations to survive. Even in the depths of poverty, human ingenuity and solidarity persisted, demonstrating a remarkable capacity for adaptation under pressure. In Britain, cities such as Glasgow, Manchester, and Liverpool, which had thrived on manufacturing, faced unemployment rates that climbed into the tens of percent. Industrial workers, once confident in their skills and trade, found themselves cast aside as factories closed or reduced production. In mining towns, families endured poverty exacerbated by harsh working conditions and inadequate housing. Social unrest became increasingly visible, with strikes, protests, and demonstrations reflecting widespread frustration at political and economic leadership. Breadlines, Unemployment offices and charitable organizations became daily realities for countless citizens. The psychological impact of this insecurity permeated culture, literature, and public discourse, shaping a generation's outlook on work, government, and community. France, with its mix of rural and urban populations, experienced a different but equally profound human cost. Agricultural decline left rural communities impoverished, while industrial workers faced layoffs and reduced wages. Families migrated to urban centers in search of work, straining already limited infrastructure and social services. The tension between urban and rural populations grew, as did frustration with government policies that seemed inadequate to address the scale of suffering. Cultural expressions of despair emerged in literature, theater, and visual arts, capturing the daily realities of hunger, unemployment, and the erosion of hope. The Depression also reinforced social inequalities, highlighting the stark divide between those who retained wealth and stability and those who struggled to survive day by day. In Asia, Japan faced significant human hardship as the economic downturn reduced demand for exported goods. Factories closed, workers were laid off, and families struggled to meet basic needs. The psychological toll of insecurity, combined with the national discourse around resource scarcity and expansion, created a complex environment where personal suffering intersected with broader political ambitions. In China and Southeast Asia, rural populations faced declining commodity prices, land insecurity, and famine in some regions, further illustrating that the human cost of the Great Depression was truly global. Latin America experienced a profound impact as well. Countries dependent on commodity exports, such as coffee in Brazil and sugar in Cuba, copper in Chile, or beef in Argentina, saw prices collapse. Farmers, miners, and laborers were thrown into poverty. Migration increased as people left rural areas in search of urban work, only to find cities struggling with unemployment and overcrowding. Governments faced crises as tax revenues fell and social unrest grew. In some regions, revolutionary movements gained momentum, reflecting the social and political consequences of widespread economic suffering. Families endured hunger, malnutrition, and uncertainty, while social cohesion was tested under extreme conditions. Even as the world struggled with material deprivation, the human cost extended beyond physical needs. Psychological trauma was widespread. Depression, anxiety, and hopelessness became common experiences. Many individuals lost not only their income, but also their sense of purpose, dignity, and identity. Men who had been the primary breadwinners faced shame and frustration, while women bore the burden of keeping families together under dire circumstances. Children experienced hunger, interrupted education, and exposure to adult stress and despair at a formative age. The Great Depression reshaped human experience, leaving scars that would persist for decades. Despite the pervasive despair, human resilience and ingenuity were remarkable. Communities developed mutual aid networks, charities, and informal economies to provide for those in need. In the United States, organizations such as the Red Cross, local churches, and neighborhood associations played critical roles in feeding families and offering shelter. In Europe, communal kitchens, social clubs, and neighborhood support networks emerged, reflecting the enduring human capacity for solidarity under extreme stress. These responses, while insufficient to fully mitigate suffering, demonstrated that even in the darkest times, societies could adapt and survive through cooperation and compassion. The Great Depression also reshaped social roles and gender dynamics. Women increasingly entered the workforce or took on income-generating activities at home. While this often came out of necessity, it also challenged traditional social norms as women assumed responsibilities that had been predominantly male. Children, too, became active participants in family survival, working in factories, selling goods, or assisting in agriculture. Education often took a backseat to immediate economic needs, altering life trajectories and societal expectations for a generation. Cultural responses to the Depression highlighted its profound psychological impact. Literature, music, and visual arts captured the pervasive sense of despair and uncertainty. Photographers like Dorothea Lange documented the human cost in stark, unforgettable images: dust-covered farmers, weary mothers, and children staring into the camera with hollow eyes. Writers chronicled breadlines, unemployment, and migration, creating narratives that emphasized resilience, struggle, and the search for hope. Films reflected social realities, offering both escapism and poignant commentary on poverty, inequality, and human suffering. These cultural artifacts not only recorded history but shaped public perception, influencing how societies understood and responded to economic crisis. Even leisure and daily routines were affected. Public events, entertainment, and social gatherings became luxuries many could not afford. Families relied on frugality, ingenuity, and communal support to survive. The psychological burden of constant scarcity altered behavior as people became more cautious, risk-averse, and conservative in financial matters. Consumer culture, once exuberant in the 1920s, gave way to pragmatism and survival, changing habits and expectations across entire societies. The global nature of the Great Depression ensured that these experiences were not confined to one nation or class. From the wealthy industrialist whose fortune evaporated overnight to the rural laborer struggling to grow enough food to feed a family, the crisis transcended boundaries. It reshaped relationships between citizens and governments, prompting demands for social welfare, economic regulation, and political accountability. Communities adapted through cooperation, families strengthened bonds through shared hardship, and societies were forced to confront the fragility of economic prosperity and the vulnerability of human life in an interconnected world. Ultimately, the human cost of the Great Depression was a reminder that economic events are never abstract. They are lived, felt, and experienced in every household, community, and individual. Poverty, hunger, unemployment, and psychological distress became daily realities for millions, while resilience, solidarity, and creativity offered glimmers of hope. The Depression reshaped societies in ways that statistics alone cannot capture, leaving a legacy of both suffering and adaptation. It is in the stories of ordinary people, those who lined up for bread, abandoned farms, migrated across continents, and persevered despite unimaginable hardship, that the true magnitude of the Great Depression is understood. The experience of despair during the 1930s also sowed seeds for future political and social movements. Workers organized for better conditions, women advocated for recognition of their contributions, and communities demanded government accountability and intervention. The human cost of the Depression was not only measured in material deprivation, but in the reshaping of societal expectations, norms, and the relationship between citizens and the state. It forced a reevaluation of economic systems, social safety nets, and the moral responsibilities of governments to protect vulnerable populations. By the time the decade of the 1930s progressed, the human experience of the Depression had fundamentally altered the way people perceived the world around them. Societies became more attuned to the fragility of prosperity, the unpredictability of markets, and the importance of collective action. Families, communities, and nations had been tested in ways that would resonate for generations. Children who had endured hunger and insecurity carried those lessons into adulthood, influencing their approach to work, family, and financial management. Adults who had navigated the hardships of unemployment, social stigma, and survival carried profound psychological impacts, shaping cultural norms and political ideologies for decades to come. The Great Depression, then, was more than an economic crisis. It was a human catastrophe on a global scale. Its consequences were lived in every street, factory, farm, and household, transforming societies and shaping the course of the 20th century. While numbers, statistics, and financial indicators provide one measure of the disaster, it is the human stories, the suffering, resilience, adaptation, and hope that truly convey the scope and impact of this era. The decade of despair left an indelible mark, a testament to both human vulnerability and human strength, reminding the world that the cost of economic collapse is always personal, always immediate, and always transformative. As the Great Depression deepened, governments around the world were confronted with a reality unlike any they had faced before. The economic collapse was not merely a short-term downturn, it was a systemic crisis that struck at the very foundations of national economies, social structures, and political legitimacy. Across continents, leaders struggled to respond to the mounting pressure from citizens whose livelihoods had been obliterated by the sudden failure of banks, factories, and farms. The 1930s demanded new approaches, innovative policies, and sometimes radical solutions, as conventional economic wisdom had proven woefully inadequate in the face of such a pervasive and devastating crisis. In the United States, President Herbert Hoover initially adhered to traditional laissez-faire economic principles. He believed that the market would naturally correct itself and that government intervention should be limited. Yet, as the economic downturn worsened, it became clear that voluntary measures and appeals to private charity were insufficient. The public grew increasingly frustrated with Hoover's perceived inaction, and his political standing suffered. Breadlines stretched across cities, unemployment soared above 15%, and Americans, once confident in their nation's economic prowess, began to doubt the ability of their government to protect them from the sweeping consequences of financial collapse. Hoover's reluctance to intervene decisively, combined with rising social unrest, underscored the limitations of traditional policies in confronting unprecedented economic calamity. The election of Franklin D. Roosevelt in 1932 marked a turning point in governmental responses to the crisis. Roosevelt's New Deal represented a dramatic shift in the relationship between the state and its citizens, emphasizing proactive intervention, relief, recovery, and reform. The New Deal was not a single policy, but a sweeping series of programs, agencies, and legislative measures designed to stabilize the economy, provide employment, and restore confidence. Public works projects, such as the construction of bridges, roads, and dams, offered jobs to millions of unemployed Americans. Agencies like the Works Progress Administration and the Civilian Conservation Corps not only provided immediate relief but also invested in long-term infrastructure improvements, leaving a tangible legacy of the government's intervention. Banking reforms were another cornerstone of the New Deal. The Glass-Steagall Act, enacted in 1933, established the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, FDIC, which guaranteed individual deposits and restored public confidence in the banking system. The Securities and Exchange Commission, SEC, was created to regulate the stock market, prevent fraud, and ensure transparency, addressing the speculative excesses that had contributed to the crash. Social programs, including Social Security, unemployment insurance, and labor protections, were introduced to provide a safety net for vulnerable populations. These measures fundamentally reshaped American society, establishing expectations that the government had a responsibility to protect its citizens from economic catastrophe. Yet the New Deal was not without controversy. Critics argued that government intervention undermined free markets, increased public debt, and concentrated power in Washington. Some business leaders resisted regulations, fearing that government oversight would stifle entrepreneurship and innovation. Despite these criticisms, Roosevelt's policies had profound effects, mitigating some of the worst impacts of the Depression and restoring a measure of hope and stability. The New Deal illustrated that in times of crisis, bold and comprehensive governmental action could be not only necessary but transformative. Across the Atlantic, European governments faced parallel challenges, though responses varied widely depending on political traditions, economic structures, and the severity of the crisis. In Britain, the national government, led initially by Ramsay MacDonald, pursued a combination of austerity measures and limited public works programs. The government sought to maintain fiscal balance while attempting to provide relief, but the scale of the Depression often overwhelmed these efforts. Industrial regions, particularly in the North, continued to experience high unemployment and social unrest. While Britain avoided the extreme political radicalization seen in Germany, the economic pressures fueled strikes, protests, and a growing demand for state intervention. Economists and policymakers in Britain increasingly debated the merits of deficit spending, government planning, and welfare provisions, laying the intellectual groundwork for post-war social reforms. France, struggling with declining industrial output and rural hardship, faced a fragmented political landscape that complicated governmental responses. The French government oscillated between austerity and intervention, with frequent changes in leadership reflecting the difficulty of managing a society in crisis. Agricultural subsidies, public works programs, and limited social welfare measures were implemented, but the scale of the Depression and political instability limited their effectiveness. The economic struggles contributed to political polarization, with extremist movements on both the left and right gaining support among populations dissatisfied with conventional parties. The tension between social stability and economic necessity created a volatile environment, highlighting the intricate link between economic policy and political legitimacy. Germany's response to the Great Depression was markedly different and ultimately catastrophic. The Weimar Republic, already weakened by reparations obligations and post-war economic challenges, found itself incapable of addressing mass unemployment and widespread poverty. Banks failed, businesses closed, and millions of citizens faced destitution. The government's inability to provide relief created a vacuum that extremist political movements exploited. The Nazi Party, led by Adolf Hitler, promised national revival, employment, and the restoration of pride to a humiliated nation. The economic collapse directly facilitated the rise of totalitarianism, demonstrating how governmental failures in addressing human suffering can have profound political consequences. The experience of Germany during the Depression serves as a stark reminder of the critical role that competent and timely governance plays in maintaining societal stability. In Japan, economic hardship triggered a turn toward militarism and expansionist policies. As industrial production declined and unemployment rose, political leaders argued that national survival required securing resources abroad. The Japanese government increasingly relied on military solutions to economic problems, culminating in the invasion of Manchuria in 1931 and subsequent expansionist actions across Asia. In this context, the link between economic collapse and aggressive foreign policy became alarmingly clear. The inability of civilian governments to provide economic security contributed to the rise of militaristic control, illustrating how financial crises can reshape the balance of power within nations and between them. Latin American nations, heavily dependent on exports, faced collapsing revenues and social unrest. Governments struggled to respond as commodity prices fell sharply, reducing tax income and destabilizing public services. Countries like Brazil, Chile, and Argentina experimented with import substitution, industrialization, tariffs, and state-led economic initiatives to mitigate the impact of falling demand. Social unrest was common, with strikes, demonstrations, and even revolutionary movements reflecting widespread dissatisfaction with governmental performance. In some cases, these pressures led to authoritarian regimes, as leaders sought to maintain order amid economic chaos. The Great Depression demonstrated that economic vulnerability often translates into political instability, particularly in nations with limited institutional capacity or heavy reliance on external markets. The global responses to the Depression reveal several key themes. First, traditional economic policies were often inadequate to address a crisis of this magnitude. Reliance on laissez-faire principles, austerity, or limited intervention proved insufficient in stabilizing societies facing widespread unemployment, collapsing banks, and plummeting trade. Second, government intervention, when applied decisively and comprehensively, could mitigate some of the worst effects of economic collapse, as exemplified by Roosevelt's New Deal. Third, the political consequences of economic failure were profound. In nations where governments failed to act or were unable to implement effective policies, extremist movements, authoritarianism, and militarism often gained support, altering the course of history in dramatic and sometimes catastrophic ways. The Great Depression also forced nations to rethink the role of the state in economic life. Prior to the 1930s, governments often saw their role as limited to maintaining law and order, protecting property, and ensuring basic market functioning. The Depression challenged these assumptions, demonstrating that in times of systemic crisis, citizens expected, and indeed required, government intervention to ensure stability, provide relief, and protect livelihoods. This shift in expectations laid the groundwork for modern welfare states, regulatory regimes, and social safety nets that would become standard features of many countries in the decades that followed. Furthermore, the crisis highlighted the interconnectedness of economic systems. Policies enacted in one nation, such as tariffs, currency devaluations, or monetary reforms, often had immediate consequences abroad. The global scope of the Depression forced countries to consider international cooperation, monetary stabilization, and trade agreements in ways that had previously been less urgent. The lessons learned during this period would shape the post-World War Roman II economic order, including institutions such as the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade (GATT), designed to prevent the recurrence of such devastating global crises. The social consequences of governmental responses were equally profound. Programs aimed at relief, employment, and social welfare altered public perceptions of civic responsibility and the relationship between citizens and the state. Individuals who had once relied solely on family, community, or religious institutions now came to see the government as a necessary provider of security and opportunity. This shift influenced political discourse for decades, fostering expectations that governments bear responsibility for mitigating economic hardship and ensuring social stability. Yet, even with intervention, the scale of the Depression meant that suffering remained widespread. While programs like the New Deal alleviated some of the worst impacts in the United States, millions continued to struggle with unemployment, poverty, and insecurity. In Europe, government measures were often insufficient or inconsistent, leaving large segments of the population exposed to economic and social risks. In developing regions, where institutional capacity was limited, the human cost was even more severe, with widespread malnutrition, migration, and social unrest. The persistence of hardship despite intervention underscores the immense challenges faced by governments attempting to respond to a crisis of this magnitude. The experiences of different nations also reveal the varied consequences of policy choices. In countries where governments acted decisively, implemented public works, regulated financial markets, and provided social safety nets, the worst effects of the Depression were mitigated and social cohesion was maintained. In nations where governments were slow to act, adhered rigidly to outdated economic orthodoxy, or lacked institutional capacity, social unrest, political radicalization, and authoritarianism emerged. The contrast highlights the central role of competent governance in shaping both economic outcomes and the broader trajectory of society. Ultimately, the governmental responses to the Great Depression were a defining aspect of the era. They illustrated the limits of traditional economic thinking, the necessity of innovative policies in the face of unprecedented crises, and the profound consequences of inaction or mismanagement. The period demonstrated that economic collapse is not merely a technical problem, but a deeply human one, requiring coordinated action across society, government, and international borders. From the New Deal in the United States to protectionist measures in Europe and expansionist policies in Asia, the 1930s were a decade in which the world learned, often painfully, that governments could not remain passive in the face of systemic economic collapse. The legacy of these responses extends far beyond the 1930s. Policies enacted during the Depression reshaped the relationship between citizens and the state, influenced economic thought, and established precedents for social welfare, financial regulation, and public intervention that continue to shape societies today. They also serve as a stark reminder of the consequences of political failure in times of crisis. In Germany, the inability to provide relief contributed directly to the rise of Nazism. In Japan, economic hardship fueled militarism. In Latin America, social unrest shaped political trajectories for decades. The choices governments made, or failed to make, during this period altered the course of history, demonstrating that the human and political consequences of economic collapse are inseparable from financial realities. The story of governmental responses during the Great Depression is therefore not only a tale of economic policy, but also of leadership, resilience, and societal adaptation. It underscores the profound responsibility of governments to respond effectively to crisis, the importance of innovative thinking when conventional wisdom fails, and the enduring consequences of policy decisions for both individuals and nations. The 1930s remain a testament to the power of governance, the fragility of economies, and the profound interconnectedness of social, political, and economic systems across the globe. The Great Depression left an indelible mark, not only on the societies it devastated, but also on the very framework of economic thought and global governance. By the time the decade of the 1930s drew to a close, nations across the world had been forced to confront the consequences of unchecked financial speculation, flawed economic policies, and the absence of effective regulatory oversight. The sheer scale of the crisis, coupled with the human suffering it wrought, fundamentally reshaped the way governments, institutions, and individuals perceived wealth, security, and global interconnectedness. The economic lessons of the Great Depression would reverberate for generations, influencing the design of policy, the development of institutions, and the very architecture of international economic systems. In the United States, the New Deal had not only provided immediate relief and jobs, but had also established enduring precedents for government intervention in times of crisis. Programs like the Civilian Conservation Corps, the Works Progress Administration, and the Tennessee Valley Authority demonstrated that state-led investment could simultaneously address unemployment, stimulate economic activity, and leave a tangible legacy in infrastructure. Beyond the tangible benefits, these initiatives fundamentally shifted public expectations. Citizens came to understand that governments bore responsibility not only for law and order, but also for economic stability, social welfare, and the protection of vulnerable populations. The New Deal, while imperfect and occasionally controversial, offered a blueprint for balancing economic dynamism with social security, a model that would inform future responses to financial crises. The regulatory reforms that accompanied the New Deal represented a profound transformation of the financial landscape. The establishment of the Securities and Exchange Commission introduced oversight of stock market practices, reducing the likelihood of speculative bubbles and fraudulent activity. The Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, which guaranteed individual bank deposits, restored public confidence in financial institutions and prevented future bank runs. These measures were more than technical fixes. They symbolized a commitment to systemic stability and underscored the moral responsibility of the state to safeguard citizens from the excesses of unregulated markets. By embedding these principles into law, the United States fundamentally redefined the relationship between government, markets, and the public, a transformation whose influence would extend far beyond the Depression itself. Globally, the lessons of the Great Depression catalyzed a reevaluation of economic orthodoxy. Prior to the 1930s, the prevailing belief among economists and policymakers was that markets, left largely unregulated, would naturally adjust to equilibrium. The Depression shattered this assumption. Economists observed that mass unemployment, collapsing demand, and financial panic could persist indefinitely without intervention, leading to prolonged societal suffering. This recognition gave rise to Keynesian economics, championed by John Maynard Keynes, which argued that governments should actively manage economic cycles through fiscal policy, deficit spending, and public investment. Keynesian thought transformed policy discourse, providing both the intellectual justification and practical framework for government-led economic stabilization. Nations that adopted these principles in subsequent decades were better equipped to mitigate the severity of recessions, demonstrating the enduring practical significance of the lessons learned during the Depression. The international ramifications of these lessons were equally profound. The global nature of the Depression had demonstrated the perils of economic isolationism, uncoordinated policy, and reliance on a single nation's financial stability. Nations recognized that trade, capital flows, and currency stability were deeply interconnected, and that unilateral actions, such as raising tariffs or devaluing currency, could exacerbate economic decline worldwide. This realization informed the creation of post-World War Roman II institutions designed to stabilize the global economy. The International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and frameworks for coordinated trade policies emerged from a collective understanding that the failures of the 1930s could not be repeated. The Great Depression had shown, in stark and painful terms, that economic shocks were not confined by borders, and that global prosperity depended on cooperation, transparency, and stability. In Europe, the economic collapse had highlighted both the fragility of democratic institutions and the dangers of political extremism. Governments that failed to provide effective economic relief faced rising social unrest, labor strikes, and the allure of radical ideologies. In Germany, the inability of the Weimar Republic to respond adequately to mass unemployment facilitated the rise of the Nazi Party, illustrating the lethal intersection of economic crisis and political vulnerability. Other European nations, observing these developments, implemented more robust social policies, unemployment insurance, and public works programs in the following decades to prevent similar political destabilization. The lessons were clear. Economic collapse could undermine not only livelihoods, but also the very foundations of governance, social cohesion, and international stability. The social implications of economic reform extended beyond immediate relief measures. In many nations, the Depression catalyzed a rethinking of labor rights, social protections, and the relationship between citizens and the state. Trade unions gained strength in the 1930s, advocating for better wages, working conditions, and social security. Governments recognized that providing basic protections, such as unemployment insurance, pensions, and health programs, was not merely a moral imperative, but a strategic necessity to maintain social stability and economic productivity. The Depression had revealed the vulnerabilities of a system that relied on fair principles and private charity, demonstrating that comprehensive, coordinated social policy was essential to prevent widespread destitution and unrest. In Asia, the Depression's lessons influenced both economic and political strategies. Japan, having suffered from collapsing exports, increasingly relied on state-guided industrial policy and resource acquisition abroad. The pressures of economic scarcity, however, also contributed to militaristic policies that ultimately had global ramifications. In China, regional economies were destabilized by declining commodity prices and disrupted trade, leading to both internal migration and social tension. Across Asia, the crisis highlighted the vulnerability of economies heavily reliant on export markets, prompting a reevaluation of domestic industrial capacity, trade policies, and governance structures. Latin America, similarly dependent on commodity exports, experienced a profound awakening to the risks of global economic dependence. Countries like Brazil, Chile, and Argentina implemented policies aimed at diversifying economies, promoting domestic industry, and reducing vulnerability to international market fluctuations. Import substitution, industrialization became a central strategy as nations sought to produce goods domestically that had previously been imported. Social reforms, including labor protections, minimum wage laws, and public works initiatives, emerged as tools to address the societal consequences of economic downturns. The lessons of the Depression were clear. Reliance on external markets without internal resilience was a perilous strategy, and proactive government planning was essential to ensure both economic and social stability. The Great Depression also transformed the way nations approached financial regulation and monetary policy. Central banks, which had previously focused primarily on maintaining currency stability, were increasingly expected to manage liquidity, provide emergency lending, and act as lenders of last resort. The United States Federal Reserve, having failed to prevent banking collapses in the early 1930s, reformed its policies to stabilize the banking system and support credit markets. Similarly, other nations recognized that central banks played a critical role not only in controlling inflation, but also in preventing systemic collapse. The lessons of the 1930s informed monetary policy for decades, emphasizing the importance of proactive oversight, transparency, and coordination with fiscal policy. Perhaps the most enduring lesson of the Great Depression was the recognition that economic crises are inherently human experiences, not merely abstract financial phenomena. Policymakers came to understand that unemployment, poverty, and social despair were not temporary inconveniences, but profound disruptions that could destabilize entire societies, alter political landscapes, and generate conflict. Economic planning and policy could no longer be divorced from social consequences. Governments needed to anticipate, prevent, and mitigate human suffering to maintain legitimacy, stability, and cohesion. The Depression had illuminated the moral as well as practical responsibilities of governance in times of crisis, shaping the ethical and institutional framework for economic intervention in the modern era. In the decades following the Depression, these lessons manifested in tangible reforms. Social welfare programs expanded, labor rights were codified, and financial markets were more tightly regulated. Governments invested in infrastructure, education, and healthcare, recognizing that resilient societies were not only morally desirable but economically prudent. International institutions were established to facilitate cooperation, stabilize trade, and provide support in times of crisis. The intellectual and practical legacy of the 1930s influenced policy responses to subsequent recessions and financial crises. From the post-World War Roman to Reconstruction to the economic shocks of the late 20th and early 21st centuries. The Depression also demonstrated the limits of isolationism and the necessity of international coordination. The interdependence of national economies, so starkly revealed by the 1930s, underscored the risks of unilateralism and protectionism. The collapse of global trade, exacerbated by tariffs like the Smoot-Hawley Act, had intensified the Depression worldwide. In response, nations increasingly recognized the need for coordinated economic policy, trade agreements, and shared frameworks for financial stability. These insights laid the foundation for a more integrated global economy in the post-war era, emphasizing cooperation over competition and foresight over reactive policymaking. Culturally and intellectually, the Great Depression shaped economic thought in ways that endure to this day. Economists, policymakers, and citizens alike internalized the lesson that markets alone cannot guarantee stability. The integration of Keynesian principles into economic planning reflected a new understanding of the dynamic between government and society. The Depression also fostered skepticism toward unchecked speculation, reinforcing the importance of regulation, oversight, and ethical responsibility in financial systems. Public consciousness was permanently altered. Citizens and governments alike recognized that prosperity is fragile, interconnected, and dependent on both prudent governance and social cohesion. The human experience of the Depression reinforced these lessons. Individuals, families, and communities confronted vulnerability in a visceral way, learning that economic security was neither automatic nor guaranteed. The necessity of savings, diversified livelihoods, and mutual support became ingrained in cultural practices. The Depression taught resilience, but it also instilled a cautious respect for the power of financial systems and the profound consequences of economic mismanagement. These lessons, lived by millions, informed both individual behavior and national policy for generations. Finally, the long shadow of the Great Depression is evident in the global institutional architecture of the modern era. From social welfare programs and labor protections to central banking oversight and international economic cooperation, the reforms and innovations of the 1930s continue to influence economic policy worldwide. The crisis demonstrated that stability requires foresight, intervention, and coordination at both national and international levels. It showed that economic collapse is not merely a technical failure, but a social, political, and human catastrophe, demanding comprehensive and compassionate responses. In reflecting on the Great Depression, it becomes clear that its lessons extend far beyond the confines of economics. They touch upon governance, morality, international relations, and human resilience. The reforms it inspired, the policies it generated, and the thinking it transformed constitute a legacy that continues to shape the world. By learning from the mistakes, successes, and failures of the 1930s, nations have been able to build institutions designed to mitigate crisis, protect citizens, and foster prosperity in an interconnected global environment. The shadow of the Depression is long indeed, but it is a shadow that has guided the creation of safer, more resilient, and